Hey everybody. So today we're going to do a little tutorial on piping. So leather piping is this in between these two seams. This is leather piping. And what it does is it adds a bunch of strength if you use a core, and then it also hides your seam. So sometimes if you make a turned out seam or a bag that you're flipping inside out, you'll see the little stitch lines. It hides that as well. We're not going to be making a full bag. We'll do that in a separate video. We're just going to be doing the piping part today because that in and of itself is a skill that is worth dedicating a whole video to. So I have this little piece cut out. We're going to make a little case type thing, and let's get into that first. So one of the most important things when I do piping, at least, is the skiving. Usually I say skiving's optional. I'm sure there are rare occasions, but with piping, I would always suggest that you skive your pieces because you're going to end up punching through a lot of very thick leather. So what I'm doing is I have my calipers set to a little under a ½ inch because I'm using my really big skiving knife that allows me to get a nice shallow skive. And I'm going to go around and skive. I'm not going to skive the top, but I'm going to skive all the other edges of my front piece. So once we have our front piece skived down, we have to make our piping. Now there are a couple ways you can make piping. The first way, which we're not going to do, is if you have a bell skiver, and I would really only recommend this if you do. I have made a little piece here. This is a piece of 4-ounce leather. And what I've done is this is about a little less than a ½ inch of the full thickness in the middle. And I went down just so I could make a little piece for you, and I skived by hand the sides. This sort of thickness will become our core. The other way you can do it is to just use a core. And then this is very similar, but not the same, to making our rolled edge handles that we've done a couple times. So I'm going to use a core on this piece, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure out roughly how much I need and give that a cut. And that will dictate how much 2-ounce leather we're going to need to cut a strip out of to wrap this in. So it's important to note that a lot of the times when people do piping, they'll skive down their core so that at the top of the bag, the piping has folded into the bag and all you're left with is a single seam. I would suggest, if you're just learning, to just go all the way to the end because you have to get your measurements just right. And this way, it's still a nice clean look. Everything's glued in. This isn't going to slide out. You can even edge paint it if you want. It's not going to make much of a difference, and it's a great way to learn. In our next project, where we do another piping project and we put all these skills together, we'll show you how to do the fade. But for this one, your first time, just put it in there and just, it'll be a piece that you appreciate. Look, this is all the work that went into this piping. You can see the core. I personally like it. I like leaving it. So what we're going to do now is we have our strip cut. This is an 1.5 inch strip that we're going to eventually cut down, but we want to have enough material so that we can get a good fold once we have our core glued in and a nice crisp line. That's going to be really important to get a nice crisp stitch line once we have our piping glued into our piece. So for our example first, right? You have a bell skiver, you want to make coreless piping. You can see I glued everything together, and all I'm going to do is fold this flat, or fold this in half. And essentially, the skived parts, the unskived part is going to act just like a core. So we're going to stick this down. And please excuse all the glue on the outside. I'm not doing this really quick here. And here's your piping without a core, right? So you see where we skive down, that is the part that we're going to sew in. And then on the outside, now this is dirt. You can see there's a lot of marks and dirt here, but we're never going to see that because this is going to be sewn on the inside, sandwiched in between two things. So while this isn't the tidiest, because I was just kind of showing you how to do it on a little piece, this honestly wouldn't matter all too much in a finished product, but you can see that without a core, we're able to get that profile that we want for piping. With a core, it's initially very similar to the rolled handles. We're just going to take our core that's much smaller than anything we use for a rolled handle. We're going to put it in the middle, and I've put some glue on it. We're just going to press that down. Again, this is one of those bone folder projects. Now, with a core, and you could do this for if you're doing a Sky version as well, I like to leave a lot extra. We're going to trim that before we install this. But what that lets me do is, it just makes it folding it up easier. I like to start in the center, and we're trying to get this matched up as best we can. Our edges here, if it's not perfect, don't worry about it. But I'm just going to focus on getting these edges nice and stuck, and then we'll go in with our bone folder and really tuck that core in to make our piping. So once we have our piping all cut out and stuck together, you can see we have a nice crisp line. You can see we have our liner or our cord in here. What we need to do is we need to get all of our gluing seams lined out, because with this we're gluing on the front of our piece and we're sewing in our piping on the front of our piece. So what can happen is, if we don't get things absolutely perfect, if I pop this out, see how you can see a little bit of glue there? Now, if I push it in, you can't see it, but we want to prevent that. You can see with all the other seams, everything is nice and tight. You don't see any glue, all the seams are good. So we want to do our best to prevent seeing any of that. Now you can go in with a rubber eraser thing and get rid of it, but you might as well try your best while you're at it. So the first thing we need to do is we need to mark our glue line on the front of our piece. Then we need to copy that on our piping, and then we're actually going to trim our piping with a strap end cutter backwards to get it a nice clean cut, so that when we flip everything inside out and we go to burnish our inside edge, everything will be nice and smooth. So I've marked where I'm going to glue to. I'm only going to glue that far on this piece. I've also marked where I'm going to glue the same seam allowance on my piping. The way I don't need the rest of this. So the way that I do it, and I'm sure there are other ways to do this, I take my edge cutter, or my belt cutter, and I line it up, and I'm going to give myself a little bit extra, because that'll give us a little room to stitch beyond and avoid that glue showing. Lock that down. Now I'm going to take my piping with the core in. This blade isn't super sharp, but it should do the trick. And I'm going to trim off all this excess, giving us a nice, super crisp and tidy line. And you can see where I marked where the glue line is going to be here, we went a little bit over it. So we're going to have a little bit of extra room, so we hopefully don't get any glue showing once we flip everything inside out. Now we have to glue this part up. This could be the most nerve-wracking part, but if you go slow and I have a couple little tricks for you, it's really not that bad. So what we're going to do is we're going to line up this nice clean edge that we made with our strap cutter with this nice slim beveled edge of our front body piece. And we're just going to go down the straight part first, and I'm going to make sure before I start to try to take a corner that my edge is nice and stuck down using my bone folder. If you have a very small mallet, you could use that as well, but we want this to be nice and stuck before we try to take any turns. Now, depending on how tight your radius is, as you can see, I could make that. It's tight, but I can make it. Before I go very far though, I want to make sure to get it extremely stuck down, because what can happen is If I kind of just get it loosely stuck down and then I keep going, it could just pop up. But you can see now we have this, and we're really, really well in stuck. And we're just gonna do that the whole way through, and you can see that it's really not that difficult once you get going, and you just wanna make heavy use of your bone folder. And I'm pushing down hard. You can see I'm making this burnish line here, which is gonna double as our stitch line, but I'm just gonna keep going back and making sure that this is stuck really, really well before I go any further. Now I'm gonna take our second corner, which I might have accidentally got that stuck. Yep, there we go. And when I'm taking this corner, I'm not pulling, I'm pushing. Not hard. You don't want to pull so much that this is going to kind of be floating like this. We want to push and make sure that we're getting as much surface area stuck as we possibly can. And if you're trying to take a super tight corner, what you can go in and you do is you can make little relief cuts. Just make sure that you're not going past your stitch line. So now that I have this corner stuck down, I'm going to go in with my bone folder, and I'm going to press this down. And don't worry if this edge isn't totally perfect, right? We can always go in and sand that just like any other leather edge. But again, I'm going to not just go and get this stuck, I'm going to go back a bit and make sure that everything is sticking, and you can hear it. As we move things, the leather's going to move around, all the tensions are going to change, and we're going to need to re-stick little parts. And then once we hit our final straight spot, it's pretty much par for the course there. I'm just going to get that stuck nice. And there we go. And this is, honestly, this is like my favorite part, because I think this part looks just so neat. I don't know what you could make with like this. I guess you could sew the outside and make like a cool thing, but you know, I just like the way that looks. So we're nice and stuck. You can see that everything is laying nice and flat. There's nothing's pulling up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim my edges, and then believe it or not, we're going to punch for the first time. We're going to end up punching this twice. But in order to make sure that we're getting our punch line outside of our glue line so that we avoid what we talked about before when you flip it inside out and see the glue, we really want to punch first before we put on our side, and then we're going to flip this over and punch through a second time so that we know where we're punching is outside of the glue line and we're not going to have any of that glue show up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my stitching chisels and I'm going to hug. You can use this line as reference, but remember, we're not going to see this stitch line at all. It's going to be on the inside of the bag. My main goal when I do this is I want to hug this piping as close as possible. That's going to get us a nice tight piping when we flip everything inside out. And more importantly, it's going to guarantee that we're not seeing any of that glue on the inside once we flip it. Because when we flip this with such a tight radius, there's going to be a lot of pressure. And we don't want to see any of that glue. We want this piping to do its job and hide that seam. So now that we have this all punched out, we need to get our side piece, or our gusset, I guess you could call it. And we're going to treat this very similar to how we treated our front piece. We're going to skive this down because we want this to be as flexible as possible to glue in here. So I've measured out my piece, I've given myself some extra, and that's why I'm saying, you know, don't worry about getting fancy and tucking your piping in for your first project. Just put it all to the end. It'll look nice and clean, but you'll get the hang of everything else going on first. Then you can really dial it in, skive this down, angle it in, do that on your next one or your third one. And when you're learning piping, do a lot of practice pieces. Don't even worry about turns or curves at first. Just do 2 little pieces, see if you can get that. That's a good way to learn. I just wanted to make one all-encompassing video to show you curves and that kind of thing. So, short story long, we're gonna skive this down before we install it. So for this piece, again, we're gonna take our stitch line, our calipers, and mark our stitch line, and this is gonna be where we're gonna glue to so that we don't get glue past our stitch line. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to glue this piece, because what we want to do is we want to make sure that we are gluing up to, but not over, the stitch line that we punched, which is why we punch it essentially twice. We punch it once, we glue down the other side, and then we punch through the back again. This is going to make sure that none of our glue shows through. And you can glue right up to the stitch. If you're getting a little glue in the holes, don't worry about it, but don't go over. And then what I like to do is, on the curves on this one, I'll go back and do kind of a second coat, because it's not super difficult, but it's nice to have that extra sticking. You'll get one coat that'll kind of stick into the leather if you're using veg tan. The second coat will get you a little bit of a better bond. That it's not so much when you're doing flat pieces to worry about, but for something like this with so many curves and tension and all that, it's worth it. So now it's time to sew in what will eventually be the side of our little pouch here. We're going to do sort of a semi-flip. The only important thing about this, I'm going to have my bone folder on deck, is that we want to make sure that our edge is perfectly lined up. Because if we go in, then that's going to bring our glue line past our stitch line. And again, as you can kind of see the theme here, the goal is to not see any glue. We want all our glue behind the stitching. So again, it's a pretty similar process. I'm just going to go very slow. And since we skived this down thin, we're able to bend that in and get a good sticking surface. And if anything, err on the side of going too far over past the seam, not in. And I always find this one actually a little bit more time consuming, not necessarily harder, just a little more time consuming than putting the actual piping on itself, oddly enough. Just because you have all the layers, and you're kind of topping it off with this guy. And you can see I'm really going in now and making sure everything's stuck. And I'm doing the same thing. I'm going to push here. You don't want to push enough to unstick it, but you just want to make sure you're not pulling and taking away any of the surface area that you could be using to get a good bond. And what you can also do is, you're seeing the back here, what I'm doing is I'm looking in here and I'm using my bone folder, and if I can see, you see how this is really nice and tight? That's what we want. If I push in and it pops back out, it'll do it on this side. Let me get to this corner here, and you can see, you'll be able to see, it lets me know that I'm not fully stuck down yet. So, we're gonna get this corner, start massaging that into place here. And you can see here, so you see I have my, let's see, we have our stitch line, our stitches that we laid here. We have our piece here. You see how I can see that this is tight, but this part isn't, obviously, because it's not stuck. So I'm gonna try to do this backwards. And I'm gonna push that in, go in with my bone folder, and you can see, now I can see that that's a nice tight joint right in there. And then all I have left is my flat part, but be very careful not to get too comfortable once you're on your last flat part. You still want this to all line up really nice. And so I'm pretty much all stuck, but I can see stitch holes. Now, I know that I have my solid, this is all glued and stuck, right? So what I can do is gently peel this back, and I can look and I can say, okay, well, I can see my stitch holes, and that's good because we don't want glue past the stitch holes. So I can go around and check. I see there's no glue. So I know that now when I go to punch the stitch holes a second time, once they go through here and I stitch it up, when I flip this inside out, I'm not gonna see any glue because there is no glue there. This part's a little weird, but we're gonna go backwards through the stitches that we already punched into our new layer. And if you're looking at it and you're going, well, Eric, you use diamond awl, isn't that going to be backwards? You're right, it is. There are companies that make reverse diamond awls, so you could keep your stitching. I always just kind of with this method say it's going to be on the inside of the bag. It doesn't need to be a perfect diamond pattern. It'll look just fine when you peek into the bag while you're getting something. And so I'm just going to go around and punch all of these holes. You can see they're coming right through, and then we're going to stitch around the outside of it. So now that we're all sewn up, we can flip it and make our bag. But what I like to do is clean up this seam and then burnish it just like it was any other wallet piece. So you can see we got pretty even here, but I always end up having some layer differences on the corners. I've already kind of cleaned this one up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my Japanese flat knife, and I'm just going to, you got to go very careful with this because you don't want to take too much off, and if your knife is super sharp, you can accidentally end up shaving a bit more than you want off. But before I take this to the sander, all I'm going to do is sort of almost chisel off this little layer here that I don't want to keep. There we go. And now that we have most of that fairly even, and you could even take a little bit more off here as well. There we go. Now I'm going to bring this over to our power sander because it'll be easier. This is about 7 ounce thick now. It'll be easier to get this fully leveled out just on the power sander. Now that we're all smooth, we're just going to finish the edge like I said, like any other wallet. So I'm going to bevel and burnish before we flip it inside out. So of course you don't have to go this far if you don't want to, but I figure it only takes a couple minutes. You get a nice smooth edge on the inside, so when the person's using it, you know, it just feels nice. So now the big thing is we have to flip this, which is a little bit easier than flipping like a full bag, but it's not easy. You're still gonna have to kind of muscle it. The big thing is don't worry about breaking anything and just push. We've done all the work, we've put all the glue in. There we go. This thing's not going to break. You're good. And so here we go. So you can see because we punched twice, we have no glue showing on any seams. Everything is exactly as it should be. And that's just what you get from when you're doing this by hand, at least. You know, of course you can get a piping foot on a sewing machine, but when you're doing it by hand, when you take the time to do all this, you see we have a nice finished seam on the inside, and everything lines up nicely. Now this is a bit of a large piping. I ran out of smaller leather cord. You can make your piping any size you like. I kind of almost like the oversized look. It's kind of a design element. But that's it. That's a little tutorial on how to practice piping by hand. I would suggest just doing straight shots if you've never done it before. Practice that way first to learn. And maybe next week we'll finish this up and make it into a full bag. So thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.